Okay, we're back again. It's been a little while, but well, not only are we back again, but we got Brian back. I'm thrilled. We got Brian Jameson of Diagnostic Biochips is joining us again. The last time we chatted, Brian, we talked about finding your beachhead market. Today we're going to start telling the broader DBC story, which I'm really excited.
How do we work our way inland from the beachhead?
Exactly, and the progress we've made since kind of figuring that out. So the title for today, everybody will get this once we get it. But if you're launching without paying customers, you're already too late. I've been leading a boot camp here at UNC. They call it around my Sell Now method, which is exactly that. But Brian, why don't we start here? Let's step back even a little bit further than the beachhead, and why don't we give a little more of the story? I came on board when around the Soma Focus product, but tell us the little history of the DBC before that and how you guys got it to the point where when I met you a year and a half or 2 years ago.
Sure. So we are really, invested in and interested in the base technology of measuring neuronal circuits. And so to us previously, what that meant was developing a class of sensors that were used as implantable devices. And that was, our really beachhead market in that space was into mostly academic labs worldwide. So these were people that looked not really at translational research, but basic science research. How does the brain work? And these were devices that initially were implanted in small animals, which usually means rodents, later non-human primates, and then even later used intraoperatively for research purposes in humans. And that was our bread and butter for a long time. That's where we were when you met us. And that space, by the way, is heating up. I mean, people probably are familiar with what Elon Musk is doing with Neuralink and, many other, what they're now calling neurotech startups.
Right.
A lot of that focus, like us, was on implants in actual brains, live brains, patients and animal models.
So,
and that's where we met us.
Is that space getting busy? What led DBC from going from the in vivo product to the in vitro? What kind of was the thinking behind that, or the impetus?
Yeah, we had kind of two main lines of thought at the time, which was, even going back a little prior to when we met, a couple years earlier.
Yep.
We thought, we're really excited by this market. We're in a good place from the point of view of technology development, sort of beating the stuffing out of our supply chain so that we had very reliable sensors. They were recognized in that class, in that arena, in vivo arena, as sort of best in class. And our question was like, what's next? Like, this is still clearly just the niche market at this point. The research space is.
Yes.
And the two areas that we sort of brainstormed and talked about, and that wasn't a surprise. That we knew when we launched the company in the commercial line of work. And the two areas that we have always talked about expanding into, and one is going to strike, people as more obvious than the other. One is medical devices.
Yes.
So if you look at what has gone on in the neuromodulation space, for example, with deep brain stimulators for Parkinson's and movement disorders, or you look at, the promise of BCI brain computer interfaces for, treating people with stroke, et cetera. These are real applications, and it's a direct application of our technology. So that was sort of thing one.
Yep.
Thing two, a little bit from left field when I tell people this story, is drug discovery.
Yeah.
And what we really looked at was the, for lack of a better way to say it, low quality, by which we mean poor predictive value of preclinical tests in the CNS, central nervous system drug discovery space.
Yes.
And the proof is in the pudding. This is not something that I usually have to overemphasize. The fact that we're really lagging behind other disease areas in terms of really disease eliminating, modifying substantial treatments for neurodegenerative disease, developmental disease, et cetera. And this is not a one solution fits all thing. In other words, there's many reasons why that's true, not least of which the brain is really complicated and our fundamental understanding of how it works is still emerging.
Yep.
But we looked at the tools that are used in the preclinical drug discovery space, and we were like, no way, that's part of the problem.
Yep.
And so we kept thinking this technology that really reads on neuronal circuits, wired together ensembles of cells, which is where the rubber meets the pavement, having a technology that read on that space. And we kept saying there's got to be an application here in drug discovery.
Right.
And that's kind of where we were when we started getting serious about going down one or the other of those paths.
Got it. And obviously you kind of, by the time I got engaged with the company, you guys had picked the second path as your next step.
Yep.
So,
and I have to confess, largely that was, it was good luck and fortune.
yes.
So we started hearing right around this time when it was getting to be, do or die time for the company. Like, we've got to scale, we've got to grow into more impactful translational markets.
Right.
We started hearing all this chatter about 3D stem cell neuronal cultures, so-called brain organoids as an example. And this notion that you can take a cell from a patient or from a donor line and essentially reverse engineer them into stem cells and then differentiate them into little mini brains. It's a little to describe it that way, but cultures of connected neurons that are not animals, but they are human cells, so-called brain organoids.
I love that. Yeah, for layman's mini brains, what the industry, what I've come to learn from you, they're called brain organoids in the scientific world in which we operate. So let's jump ahead. So a couple things. One is, man, so you saw this big unmet need just in treating patients with brain diseases in the discovery meet. And then you actually narrowed that down to the more front end of the pipeline as building a tool that can help target and select programs, the advanced new programs, with the intent of getting better drugs on the market to help these huge unmet needs, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, you got Parkinson's, some of the ones that. So let's jump ahead. When you met me, so tell me where you were. You had this big collaboration going on with Merck. And so tell a little bit of story of when I got involved or where we were about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and where your thinking was on the relationship with Merck and, where you were from a market development standpoint, what you were looking for.
So we had started, some very halting and haphazard market discovery work.
Yeah.
And, not really knowing how to do that properly, we pulled on the usual threads, and we really emphasize, look, our application is pharma. We've got to go to pharma and talk to a bunch of people in pharma and figure out whether our read of the situation was correct. And our read of the situation was there's all this work, attention, time, money, research going into developing these 3D cell cultures. That's what these are, in vitro or cell cultures, as a model of disease state and as a test bed for trying out treatments. And this is all driven by pharma.
Yep.
And we were reading these signals that there was no good, the biology was great and emerging and growing, no great readout for those stem cell cultures that are now neuronal cultures. And that was a hypothesis. That's all it was. We looked at these, 3D cultures. These are millimeter scale structures. We said, we are really good at reading out single cell neuronal activity of circuits in millimeter scale structures, like brain target regions. And it all seems to line up, but we had no actual market validation, except for the very fortuitous connection you mentioned with Merck.
Yeah, I was going to say, but you had one big real signal from Merck at that point in time, right?
Exactly. It
was a big signal.
And they have been unbelievable collaborators, partners, and that's what they are. They are really, the group we're working with at Merck's driving the biology forward. We're driving the hardware readout forward. We're working together. We're co-publishing. They've put non-trivial money into the development, and their task, just like ours, this is an assay development research group. And their task, just like ours, is to connect with discovery groups and
Right.
say, we've got this model system, meaning, disease model plus readout that's really useful to discovery. So that in and of itself, as much as it was enabling and game changing for the company, it wasn't really a market signal.
No, but it was one data
There
point.
was someone else in the world thinking like we were,
Right.
out, that this is useful out over the horizon. And so that's where you came in. Like, really, let's be skeptical. What's the market signal here?
Well, I remember I remember one of our very early discussions. I said, "What do we want to do?" And you said, "Well, we want to get 2 or 3 more Mercs."
Exactly.
Right? You said something very similar to that, and I said back to, I said, "Well, let's hold off. Let's not try to start selling 2 or 3. Let's go do the customer discovery and see if that data signal of 1 was going to translate to a data signal of 3, 4, 5." Right?
Like, are we now hitched up to a rocket ship that is leaving the launch pad, and all we have to do is all we have to do is design an instrument that meets those demands in pharma, and then the orders are going to come pouring in. Like,
Exactly.
like, really, is that what's happening here?
And I love how you said that, because I was going to say something. I'm saying this is not an unusual story for a startup company with a novel technology. We find one, well, in this case, turned out to be an innovator, really early innovator, that says, "Yes, we want to do this with you." They make an investment, and then the company then goes forward to build out the whole product, intent of, once they have that product, to start selling. And we took a very different path. So tell us what we learned and what we did.
So before I do that, and you can answer just as well as I can, but the stakes were actually quite high in retrospect. Like, if the moment had been different, in the end, and it had been everybody in pharma, discovery groups in pharma are ready to rock and roll today, we would have built quite a different instrument. We would have immediately had to jump into building a high throughput screening type instrument, at least 96 wells, maybe more, right out of the gate.
And I remember when I was talking with you, that was one of your big questions at the time. Should we just go straight to that device?
Yeah. Amen.
And that would have been a very different path. It would have been a very costly path and a very dangerous path.
I think
it turned out
to have been a big mistake.
It would have been a big mistake. So
we're not talking about, the time differences. Like, by the way, now we are developing such an instrument.
Yes.
But we should come back to that. I mean, because that's not where we launched, and we launched on the basis of listening to this market discovery that we jointly did.
So tell us what we learned. Tell the audience what we learned from that and where we ended up going.
So what we learned was that there was this group of, I discussed early in the company's history, this really basic research, users, the customers we had that are probably number in, the hundreds of labs worldwide that are just straight up basic research. When I say basic, I mean, like, how does the brain work? Not disease, not therapy, just where are we with the basic science? That was our customer base. And then we pictured, okay, now we're pivoting into something different. We're pivoting into pharma, therapy, genetic therapies, and people that want to screen. But what we actually discovered was there's this big, really important group in the middle that we discovered this because we kept talking to them over and over again.
Well, let's step back for a second, Brian. I think we discovered something before that.
Okay.
Because we aimed at pharma right out of the gate with the discovery, and we kind of found that Merck was just a pure outlier, and we could not find anybody else who was willing to take the risks and had you and I talked a lot about this, the profile of that early risk taker, that real true innovator that's willing to take those type of risks.
Yeah, and lived in pharma.
We basically found we talked to tens, if not more, pharma companies and had these conversations, and basically no one was at the place that Merck was. So that was kind of the first discovery, right?
It was, and also an addendum to that, the question we kept asking was, well, what gets you there?
Yes.
Because certainly, iPSC cultures in general, and the 3D cultures where we play, the organoids, definitely on their radar screen. You can see in other modalities besides neuro, this is being adopted quickly. Roche spun out a big institute, the IHB, just to look at organoids. So there was signal all over the place that they were interested in organoids, and yet they weren't quite where we wanted them to be as a screening tool readout. And we kept asking, what gets you there?
Right.
And the
And they
answer,
weren't, and going back to the earlier conversation, they weren't where we needed them to be to build that other product and go
yeah,
full on that other product,
yeah.
which was really good news. And let's talk about that now. Now tell that translational story. We'll come back to why the current product worked in that space.
So the answer to what do you, Mr. or Mrs. Pharma, what do you need to see to be a believer and to be sort of ready to develop the assays and move this forward as an important screening tool? The answer was, evidence from what we came to call translational labs. So, publication records, et cetera, and people that we could hire to run the tools out of academia, et cetera. So it's this base set of proof points.
Yep.
And happily, that market already existed. Like they were coming at us through the discovery process,
Yep.
Head over heels, ready to talk to us. Like, we need a readout for these disease models that were these brain organoid disease models.
Right.
You guys are it. So very high degree of enthusiasm,
Yep.
relatively low throughput, meaning, if you can get through 10 organoids a day with a grad student in an afternoon, this is scads of data. And we want to publish, we want to go to conferences, we want to, sort of get data we can't get other ways. And back to the who are they question, these are not basic science researchers. These are people that are talking about developing compounds that are translating. So they're sort of positioned between that basic science. So these are, institutes that have a charter to do drug discovery. These are academic groups who are tilted more towards, they're in neuropharmacology departments and, areas like.
The interesting thing, at least from my perspective, was they're kind of different places. So some of them sat in academic settings, but they had a translational intent.
Yep.
Like I remember Penn had a translational drug development research organization that we engaged with. Some of them sat in nonprofits. Well, a lot of them sat in nonprofits. It looked like a Scripps or a Lieber Institute. And then some of them were in like kind of these nonprofits that were disease associated in the brain disease area. But they were, the commonality across them all is they sat between pure academic research and pharma doing this more translational work.
Yes. And I would throw in also, we tend to talk inherently about pharma a lot, but I would include, sort of all therapeutic modalities. So, genetic therapy, even potentially cell therapy, et cetera.
Yep.
Development and regulatory approval, which we should talk about also, of therapies.
Yes.
And with that role of a preclinical instrument like ours in that situation. So that became our target customer base now, that group of translational research group.
Yes.
Yep.
And the other thing that I think is really good for our audience here is that's a pretty small niche market, which, on the blush from an investor's viewpoint, it's way too small of a market from all that stuff. But a couple things happen in those small markets. First of all, you find where the problem and the need is a right fit. Oftentimes you have to go small to do that. The other thing is it's a pretty small market. So it's easy to target. They know, a lot of them know each other. So I know we've been getting a lot of cross referrals in that space, and versus broader markets. So I think there's some advantages there from a beachhead go to market strategy that we've been able to leverage as well. I think, but the other thing I think you pointed on is the device we had exactly at the time, which was a beta device that we had out in some pilots already, fit that market where what it wanted to do right then and there.
Yes, that's right. And so we discovered, and this really gets to the title of the talk, like how do you generate paying customers before you have something to ship them? The answer is, prototypes. And, this notion of an early access or early adopter program, which we leaned on very, very heavily, not just with Merck, but with multiple other people.
So tell the audience about, and you had some pilots where you had devices in, but they weren't paying us at the time, if I recall correctly, other than Merck. Merck obviously was.
Yeah, well, I think we should make a timeline at some point, but I feel like when we started working with you on the market discovery, we did not have any prototypes placed with anyone other than Merck that was working.
Oh, really? Okay.
And then, the discovery process really, this was the next step. Out of people we talked to who were interested, a lot of them very quickly were like, well, we'd like to see this.
Yep.
Then we're stuck in the weird position of, we don't have a commercial unit. And so if you think about it from an engineering, customer support, field engineering point of view, this means you're bringing a prototype,
Yep.
building, paying for, and delivering and installing, all of which is, that's an expensive customer acquisition process.
Yep.
And we just went for it. And to your question, initially it was 2 or 3 labs.
Yep.
And we got out there, they loved the data, and wanted to publish, started putting us in proposals, and we started talking about the instrument launch at that point,
Right.
making sure that people were building us into their budgets, their future budgets for a commercial instrument.
Right.
Then the whole thing really started to explode, and we started, we are a 8, now just recently 9-person company.
Yep.
Almost all engineering, and we started to struggle with the wheels were starting to wiggle with that level of prototypes, and we sort of, the pushback initially from the engineering team was, we can't do 10 of these.
Yes. Yes.
We can't fly all, and one was international.
Yep.
We can't support. Just think about it from a cost of goods point of view.
Yep.
The prototypes were, I'm not going to say, but they were well into the 5 figures per prototype.
Yep.
And that's real money for a company that is arguably, we're bootstrapped. I hate to use the word undercapitalized, but we kind of were.
Well, you have to capitalize the product itself, but then you have to capitalize flying on site to install and train and
our engineering staff, or a third of our engineering staff.
But very quickly we put together an early adopter, early access program. We started, instead of doing free pilots, very quickly we went to paid pilots.
Bingo.
So tell us a little bit about that, Brian. That's what the audience really wants to hear about.
So it was a combination. It was a combination of just flat out charging money.
Yep.
Like, look, this is what, and that's not going to be the full eventual retail price of the instrument, because it has warts, and we're acknowledging that. So we nominally, without getting too specific, we nominally sort of conceptually thought about it as a 50% discount.
Yep. Yeah, sure.
This instrument for 50% discount. We were very flexible about payment terms. We have people that are on a rental program, people that just wrote us a check, whatever. So that
there's a step before that too, that you and I took, and we started asking people to pay us. And I know some of the engineers pushed back on that a little bit early on, and you and I got insistent. We got to get paid for doing this work, especially for bringing real value to these places, which we were.
Yeah, look, I am the CEO of the company, but I'm also founder and large shareholder, and sometimes I've been a debtor or
right, a funder.
So I don't think you had to push me very hard to look for money, but you're right. There is a cultural question of who's doing who a favor.
I didn't have to push you hard, but some of the other team took a little bit more to.
But look, there is, and I think anybody who's thinking about doing this, you're going to feel this. There's a cultural question of who's doing who a favor. Like, are you, in the lab doing us a favor by trying? And you will encounter people that absolutely frame it that way.
Yes.
You can think, Chris, because you've heard it. Some of the folks that are like, man, you should just be grateful. You should give it to us for free. Give us all your labor. And I get that argument. But the truth, that's not the truth. That would imply that we have no value to them. And our whole contention is, this is a new instrument modality. You're getting data that you currently cannot get any other way, and you're getting access to that.
And for them, we were solving a problem that they had that they needed to solve. I think that's, but I also think that cultural thing, it's not, if we looked at the situation, it would not, people would, of course you're bringing value. Of course we should pay you. But there's a cultural thing that when a startup company has a new product that's a beta phase, that they should be doing it for free. And a lot of the big companies create that cultural thing.
Yes.
It's not the right thing for a startup company at this stage. If we're bringing value and you're solving real problems, then there's a real exchange of value going back and forth.
Agreed. Yeah. And we managed to make that point. And obviously, to some degree, it's self-selecting. Like, we didn't head with the companies that, and I don't mean to imply that, like, they're bad people or you know, it's not that they're thinking about it wrong. That's just the sort of model that they brought to the potential relationship, and it didn't work for us for where
and the beauty of the early access program is we can put the program in front of them and say, hey, listen, this is a beta product. It's an early access program. If you want to engage now, if you see value in engaging now, engage. But if not, we'll have a commercial product in 6 or 12 months. You know, we can talk then, and that's completely
right,
fine.
demo for you then, the commercial unit. There is one other there's another bin though. So we sort of ran into these distinct ways of looking at it. One was like, you know, come give us free stuff and we'll help you figure it out. One was we're willing to pay, you know, on a little give and take relationship. We're getting early technology access. You're getting a customer. Let's make it work. And yes, there's some money that from a practical point of view needs to change hands. And then there was a third category of, look, we're a small startup and we're largely bootstrapped and we love sweat equity. And there was this model of customer sweat equity, like, hey, we're willing to get some pilot data, put you guys into a proposal and collectively get this thing funded. And you know, big shout out to two groups, you know, Brady Maher at Libra Institute. We successfully, and the state of Maryland, you know, thank you, the Stem Cell Research Fund within the state of Maryland, TEDCO, really nice enabling grant that we got very quickly to work with Brady. He got money, we got money to move it forward. And then another one is Flora Vaccarino at Yale, with whom we have submitted several proposals. And that, you know, that's in the works. So they put a lot of time and effort into both groups' proposal preparation and generating some early cash flow for the company that way.
I think I appreciate you bringing that up, Brian, because that's a really good point. Compensation doesn't have to be in cash. Compensation, exchange of value doesn't have to be in cash. And as you say, you know, in their kind, in their effort, in a partnership, moving this whole thing, it can come in many different ways. But it's important that when there's an exchange of value, there should be an exchange of compensation at some level.
Yep.
So really good point. Let's bump ahead here, and you know, we're still right now. We're about 3 months from having 3 months from having our commercial product, and we have a pretty good pipeline in place. Let's go back to SFN back in November, and we've got a couple more minutes. We're going to have to wrap, but you know, we pre-launched at SFN, and we could have made it a 3-day event. We actually made it a 6-month event leading up to it. Tell us a little bit about what we did leading up to SFN, and the result of SFN is our first real meeting where we launched Soma Focus.
Yeah, I mean, SFN, for those who don't know, Society for Neuroscience Conference. It is the big neuro conference, international conference. You know, each year it's always in either late October, early November, and this was a great place for us. A lot of over the past years, and this is how we came to know about it. Massive emerging emphasis on brain organoids.
Yep.
And the audience is tilted towards research and translation. It's not known to be a huge pharma conference, but knowing what we knew about that translation, the importance of focusing early on translational sales, you know, with what became our Soma Focus instrument, we knew that this is the right launch, you know, window, and we only had, you know, it only happens once a year. So if we had missed last year, we would be launching this year. And we decided just to get out over our skis. We knew that the full commercial version of the instrument wouldn't be ready till about now. And we figured, look, let's make it a soft launch, announce that the instrument, show pictures of it.
Yep.
Because, you know, it was running operationally. It just didn't have a pretty skin and it wasn't integrated into a unit. And we decided to go for that sort of soft launch and generate as many leads, meet them where they were, wherever they were with the leads. If it was, hey, we've got to wait to see a real commercial instrument availability and then bring it and show us, fine, but we've got that lead captured. Or if it's, we want to be one, we've heard about this early access program, we want to do that.
Yep.
You know, and circling back to my early comment about the engineering feedback, we can't do any more of these. Well, we stretched after SFN and we did more. So we developed a very healthy lead pipeline on the basis of that activity. No regrets. I mean, it's a nerve-wracking feeling to be that far out over your skis.
Yep.
You know, you've got people at your booth saying like, "Oh, you guys are launching. Where's the instrument?" And you're like, you know, here's a picture of it. And we talked about in advance, is that hokey but we decided no, as long as you're conveying an accurate picture where you are, you're getting people excited. It's a new product category. They need to start getting their minds around it early. no regrets that we did that.
And back then we were 6 months prior to having the commercial product, and that was a meeting. We weren't actually just talking about some folks. We were actually selling it and pitching it right then and there. Even still 6 months, and I know we've closed one or two of those as early access customers already.
We have, yes, we have a customer. I don't think I'm going to name, but they, we had never met them before SFN, got them in the pipeline, had the usual qualification follow-up, became an early access customer, and now there's a PO for a commercial instrument, in the pipeline.
Yep.
None of that would have happened without that early launch.
And we generated 180 marketing qualified leads. Those are all in the pipeline as well. And those people are ready for when we have a commercial product. So, Brian, we got to wrap up. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Why don't we do so? One piece of advice or advice given to a company that's still 12, 18 months prior to a product launch in the space. What advice would you give to a CEO?
I mean, no surprise. You know what I'm going to say? Figure out a way to get some version of your product into their hands.
Yeah.
ASAP, like now.
Yep.
And you can be selective about who that is. You want to be selective about who that is, but very useful feedback.
Cool. Brian, thank you again. Thanks for telling the DBC story. We will probably come back in 12 or 18 months from now. We'll tell it from this point to where we are then as well. So
I look forward to that.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure working with you. And I love this because everything you talk about is, wrapped around my Sell Now method that I'm teaching in boot camps, that type of stuff. You and DBC are the personification of the value of launching new technologies in the life science, healthcare, medtech space the right way. So, Brian, thanks. Have a great weekend, and we'll wrap this one up for today.
We appreciate all your help. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, Brian.
Ciao.